Civil resistance is political action that relies on the use of nonviolent resistance by civil groups to challenge a particular power, force, policy or regime. Civil resistance operates through appeals to the adversary, pressure and coercion. It can involve systematic attempts to undermine the adversary's sources of power, both domestic and international. Forms of action have included demonstrations, vigils and petitions, strikes, go-slows, boycotts and emigration movements, and sit-ins, occupations, and the creation of parallel institutions of government. Civil resistance movements' motivations for avoiding violence are generally related to context, including a society's values and its experience of war and violence, rather than to any absolute ethical principle. Cases of civil resistance can be found throughout history and in many modern struggles against both tyrannical rulers and democratically elected governments. The phenomenon of civil resistance is often associated with the advancement of democracy. Historical examples. Civil resistance is a long-standing and widespread phenomenon in human history. Several works on civil resistance adopt a historical approach to the analysis of the subject. Cases of civil resistance, both successful and unsuccessful, include Mohandas K. Gandhi's role in the Indian independence movement in 1917–47, the U.S. civil rights struggle in the 1960s, led by Martin Luther King, Jr., aspects of the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland in 1967–72, the revolution of the Carnations in Portugal in 1974–5, supporting the military coup of the 25th of April 1974, the Iranian Revolution in 1977–79, before Khomeini's advent to power in February 1979. The People Power Revolution in the Philippines in the 1980s that ousted President Marcos. The campaigns against apartheid in South Africa, especially before 1961, and during the period of 1983–94. The mass mobilization against authoritarian rule in Pinochet's Chile, 1983–88. The Tiananmen Square protests of 1989 in China. The various movements contributing to the revolutions of 1989 in Central and Eastern Europe, and to the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. The campaign against Serbian domination in Kosovo, 1990–98, that was followed by war. The revolutions in Serbia in 2000, Georgia in 2003, and Ukraine in 2004, all of which involved successful resistance against an incumbent government that had refused to acknowledge its defeat in an election and had sought to falsify the election results. The Cedar Revolution in Lebanon in 2005, following the assassination of former Prime Minister Rafik Hariri on 14 February 2005, and calling for Syrian withdrawal from Lebanon. The demonstrations, mainly led by students and monks, in the Saffron Revolution in Burma in 2007. The 2009 Iranian presidential election protests following evidence of electoral manipulation in the elections of June 2009. The Arab Spring uprisings in the Middle East and North Africa, starting in Tunisia in December 2010, and resulting, in 2011, in the fall of rulers in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya and Yemen. The Gezi Park protests in Turkey in 2013, in opposition to urban development plans, and also to government encroachments on freedom of expression and on Turkey's secularist traditions. The early phases of the Euromaidan protests in Ukraine in 2013–14, demanding closer integration with European Union countries, and the resignation of President Viktor Yanukovych. The 2014 Hong Kong protests, also known as Occupy Central, and the Umbrella Movement, opposing the 2014–15 Hong Kong electoral reform in the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. Numerous other campaigns, both successful and unsuccessful, could be included in a longer listing. In 1967, Gene Sharp produced a list of 84 cases. He has followed this with further surveys. In 2013, Maciej Bartkowski authored a long list of cases in the past 200 years, arranged alphabetically by country. Effectiveness of civil resistance. It is not easy to devise a method of proving the relative success of different methods of struggle. Often there are problems in identifying a given campaign as successful or otherwise. In 2008, Maria J. Stephan and Erica Chenoweth produced the most thorough and detailed analysis of the rate of success of civil resistance campaigns, as compared to violent resistance campaigns. After looking at over 300 cases of both types of campaign, from 1900 to 2006, they concluded that non-violent resistance methods are likely to be more successful than violent methods in achieving strategic objectives. Their article noted particularly that resistance campaigns that compel loyalty shifts among security forces and civilian bureaucrats are likely to succeed. The evidence of several of the 2011 uprisings, on the other hand, appears to provide contrasting pathways by which this logic may fail to materialize, with splits in the armed forces contributing towards civil war in Libya and Syria, and a shift in armed forces loyalty in Egypt failing to contribute towards enduring democratic reform. Criticisms of the central thesis of why civil resistance works have included: 1. Forming judgments about whether a campaign is a success or failure is inherently difficult. The answer may depend on the time frame used, and on necessarily subjective judgments about what constitutes success. Some of the author's decisions on this are debatable. 2. Regimes transitioning from autocracy to democracy tend to be highly unstable, so an initial success for a movement may be followed by a more general failure. 3. Perhaps, more generally, sufficient account is not taken of the possibility that violence often takes place in circumstances that are already violent and chaotic, stacking the odds against any successful outcome for violence. Reasons for choosing to use civil resistance. Some leaders of civil resistance struggles have urged the use of non-violent methods for primarily ethical reasons, while others have emphasized practical considerations. Some have indicated that both of these types of factor have to be taken into account, and that they necessarily overlap. In his chapter on Pilgrimage to Nonviolence, Martin Luther King gave a notably multifaceted account of the various considerations, experiences and influences that constituted his intellectual odyssey to nonviolence. By 1954 this had led to the intellectual conviction that nonviolent resistance was one of the most potent weapons available to oppressed people in their quest for social justice. In one of her BBC Wreath lectures, first broadcast in July 2011, Aung San Suu Kyi, the Burmese pro-democracy campaigner, stated, Gandhi's teachings on non-violent civil resistance and the way in which he had put his theories into practice have become part of the working manual of those who would change authoritarian administrations through peaceful means. I was attracted to the way of non-violence, but not on moral grounds, as some believe, only on practical political grounds, relationship to other forms of power. The experience of civil resistance suggests that it can at least partially replace other forms of power. Some have seen civil resistance as offering, potentially, a complete alternative to power politics. The core vision is of non-violent methods replacing armed force in many or all of its forms. Several writers, while sharing the vision of civil resistance as progressively overcoming the use of force, have warned against a narrowly instrumental view of non-violent action. For example, Joan V. Bondurant, a specialist on the Gandhian philosophy of conflict, indicated concern about the symbolic violence of those who engage in conflict with techniques which they, at least, perceive to be non-violent. She saw Gandhian satyagraha as a form of creative conflict, and as contrasted both to violence and to methods not violent or just short of violence. It is generally difficult in practice to separate out entirely the use of civil resistance and power political considerations of various kinds. One frequently encountered aspect of this problem is that regimes facing opposition taking the form of civil resistance often launch verbal attacks on the opposition in terms designed to suggest that civil resistance is simply a front for more sinister forces. It has sometimes been attacked as being planned and directed from abroad, and is intimately connected to terrorism, imperialism, communism, etc. A classic case was the Soviet accusation that the 1968 Prague Spring, and the civil resistance after the Soviet-led invasion of August 1968, were the result of Western machinations. Such accusations of sinister power political involvement are often presented without convincing evidence. There can be some more plausible connections between civil resistance and other forms of power, although civil resistance can sometimes be a substitute for other forms of power, it can also operate in conjunction with them. Such conjunction is never problem-free. Michael Randall has identified a core difficulty regarding strategies that seek to combine the use of violent and non-violent methods in the same campaign. The obvious problem about employing a mixed strategy in the course of an actual struggle is that the dynamics of military and civil resistance are, at some levels, diametrically opposed to each other. However, the connections between civil resistance and other forms of power are not limited to the idea of a mixed strategy. They can assume many forms. 8 ways in which civil resistance can in practice relate to other forms of power are identified here, with examples in each case. Civil resistance is often a response to changes in constellations of power. Leaders of civil resistance campaigns have often been acutely aware of power political developments, both domestic and international. In some countries there has been a growth of civil opposition after, and perhaps in part because of, and occupying or colonial states' internal political turmoil or setbacks in war. For example, this was a key factor in the Finnish struggle of 1898 to 1905 against Russian control. In other countries, the problems faced by their own armed forces, whether against conventional armies or guerrillas, played some part in the development of civil resistance. For example, in the People Power Revolution in the Philippines in 1983 to 86. Civil resistance campaigns frequently lead to a situation of partial stalemate, in which negotiation between civil resistors and those in positions of governmental power is perceived as essential. Hence, roundtable talks were critically important in the Indian independence struggle up to 1947, in Solidarity's campaign in Poland up to 1989, and in Ukraine in 2004. The relation between civil resistance and the military coup d'état can be especially multifaceted. In some cases a civil resistance campaign has been an effective response to a military coup. In other cases a campaign could succeed in its final objective, e.g., the removal of a hated regime, only when there was the reality or the threat of a military coup to bring about the desired change. Thus, the 1963 Buddhist crisis in South Vietnam, a long civil resistance campaign against the government, resulted in change only when the South Vietnamese army coup of 1–2 November 1963 toppled President Ngo Dinh Diem. In Egypt in June–July 2013, a civil resistance movement in effect called for a military coup. Peaceful demonstrators and a petition supported by millions of signatures demanded the replacement of the elected Muslim Brotherhood government, and provided a degree of revolutionary legitimacy for the army takeover of 3 July 2013. At least one non-violent campaign, the Revolution of the Carnations in Portugal in 1974–5, was in support of a military coup that had already occurred. This campaign helped to steer Portugal in a democratic direction. Some non-violent campaigns can be seen as reluctant or unwitting harbingers of violence. For example, if they are perceived as failures, or are repressed with extreme violence, they may be followed by the emergence of groups using armed force or by military intervention from outside the territory concerned. This was the case, for example, in Northern Ireland in 1967–72, and in Kosovo in the 1990s. The possibility of such developments can be an inducement to a government to bargain with a non-violent movement before things get out of hand. However, in several countries in the Middle East and North Africa in 2011 and after, campaigns by civil resistance movements were followed by violent internal conflict and civil war, often with the involvement of external forces. Syria is the most tragic case. There have also been some cases of certain uses of force by civil resistance movements, whether against their adversaries or to maintain internal discipline. For example, on the 2nd of February 2011, in the generally peaceful Egyptian struggle against President Mubarak, some groups among the crowds in Tahrir Square in Cairo did use certain forms of force for a defensive purpose when they were attacked by pro-regime thugs, some of whom were riding on horses and camels. In the subsequent days, the crowds in Tahrir Square reverted to using non-violent methods. Some civil resistance movements have sought, or welcomed, a measure of armed protection for their activities. Thus, in the U.S. civil rights movement of the 1960s, the Freedom Ride of May 1961, having been opposed violently, received armed protection for part of its hazardous journey, and the Selma to Montgomery March of March 1965 only succeeded in reaching Montgomery, Alabama, at the third attempt, when it was protected by troops and federal agents. Some campaigns of civil resistance may depend on the existence of militarily defended space. A life-saving example of an effective civil resistance enabling threatened people to reach a defended space occurred with the rescue of the Danish Jews in 1943, when thousands of Jews were spirited out of German-occupied Denmark and across a narrow stretch of sea to Sweden. When leaders of even the most determinedly non-violent movements have come to power in their countries, they have generally accepted the continued existence of armed forces and other more or less conventional security arrangements. For example, in 1991 Václav Havel, who had been a leading figure in civil resistance in communist Czechoslovakia from the founding of Charter 77 to the Velvet Revolution of 1989, in his new capacity as President of the Czech and Slovak Federative Republic, paid tribute to the NATO alliance. On 12 March 1999, the Czech Republic, along with Poland and Hungary, became a member of NATO. Proposals for defense by civil resistance. The promise of civil resistance as a means of opposing oppressive rule has led to many proposals that countries might rely, in whole or in part, on civil resistance as a means of defense against external attack and internal usurpation. Preparations for such resistance are sometimes seen as potentially helping to deter such threats in the first place. Various terms have been used to describe either the policy of relying on such non-military action by a society or social group, or the general phenomenon of sustained country-wide campaigns against outside attack or dictatorial rule. These terms, all near synonyms, include defense by civil resistance, non-violent defense, civilian-based defense, and social defense. For further information and references to some relevant literature, see social defense. The term civil resistance, merits and concerns. The term is not new. Gandhi used it in many of his writings. In 1935 he wrote, "I found that even civil disobedience failed to convey the full meaning of the struggle. I therefore adopted the phrase civil resistance. It is a near synonym for nonviolent resistance, civil disobedience, people power and satyagraha. While each of these terms has its uses and connotations, civil resistance is one appropriate term to use in cases where the resistance has a civic quality, relating to a society as a whole, where the action involved is not necessarily disobedience, but instead involves supporting the norms of a society against usurpers, where the decision not to use violent methods is not based on a general philosophy of nonviolence, but on a wide range of prudential, ethical and legal considerations, and where the technical and communications infrastructure of modern civil societies provides a means of organizing resistance. Because of such considerations, the term has been used in this century in many analyses in academic journals. All these terms have merits, and refer to largely the same phenomena. Indeed, there is a long history, in many languages, of using a wide variety of terms to describe these phenomena. The term, civil resistance, has been used increasingly for two main reasons. It emphasizes the positive rather than the negative. It conveys, more effectively perhaps than such terms as nonviolent resistance, that a movement's avoidance of violence in pursuit of a particular cause is not necessarily tied to a general belief in nonviolence in all circumstances, nor to a philosophy of Gandhism, but rather arises from the particular values and circumstances of the society concerned. There have been concerns that the term, civil resistance, might on occasion be misused, or at least stretched in a highly controversial way, to encompass acts of violence, thus, arising from experience within the anti-globalization movement. One participant observer has seen new forms of civil resistance as being associated with a problematic departure from a previously more widely shared commitment to maintaining nonviolent discipline. Because of these concerns, those who have used the term civil resistance have tended to emphasize its nonviolent character, and to use it in addition to, and not in substitution of, such terms as nonviolent resistance.